beginning of Composing the Soul, where he says, you know, it's funny, I have this feeling that as I'm thinking and working on myself or something like that, that I'm doing this for everybody. Can I just take a look at it and see? Because it might be, I think it's right at the beginning. If I can't find it immediately, we won't bother.
So that I didn't bring my deck. Yeah, I have it with me in Krakow.
Yes, right. It's a note from 1880, and he says, "Strange, I am dominated at every moment by the thought that my history is not only a personal one, that I'm doing something for many people when I live like this and work on and write about myself this way. It is as if I were a multiplicity, which I address in intimate, serious, and comforting terms." So he is actually saying, this is a note from 1880. It's right at the beginning of my introduction. Yeah, it's the epigraph to it. It's page 1. Yes, page 1. But that's so interesting, that I'm doing something for many people when I live like this and work on and write about myself this way. And so I think that's what I would say, is that that was his task. You know, he called it his Aufgabe, and that it was connected with everybody else. You know, that his working on himself this way, writing about himself this way, was something for the public as well. And that's another connection with Emerson that's so important, is this notion of the experimental. The Versuch is, he's putting it out there, as you said, exemplifying. And, well, what do we do with that? Does it mean anything to us? Well, we have to try it out in our experience. So the whole world is will to power, and nothing besides. Well, let's try that. How is it if you and I live that way, as if it's all one and we're connected with it, and it's just various concentrations of it here and there and so on, and it's all intention and attracting itself and repelling itself at the same time.
So this wasn't just a thought experiment, it was a true experiment.
Right, I think an experience experiment. And you just think, I mean, to think about, to put oneself in Nietzsche's position, he's writing in his own blood, for heaven's sake. He's killing himself, getting these books out, and nobody's reading them. And the few people that are reading them aren't understanding it, aren't understanding them. And then I think, you know, he several times sort of thinks, well, maybe in 100 years, or, you know, maybe there'll be, I think he clearly had a sense that he would be better understood, but certainly it wasn't happening for him at the time. And this is why I think there are certain versions of the sort of the postmodern Nietzsche that I'm not very sympathetic to, where people tell me, oh, you've got to get away from, you know, Nietzsche, the human being, because the author's dead, we've gone beyond that, and so on. But if you know anything about his life, or if you read what he says about himself, I mean, the man absolutely wanted to say something. Yes. And because he thought humanity could do better than it's been doing. And I think that was his Aufgabe, was, can I contribute, can I say things, can I write things that will enhance the species? And I think he killed himself doing that. He already drove himself over the edge. I mean, something that interests me is between, say, in the mid 1880s, I mean, between Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil, when there's that significant shift between life as will to power and then the world as will to power. You know, that in Zarathustra it's only, it's life that says to him that she is will to power, and that all life is will to power. Now, of course, a very important thing about the eternal return is that that's predicated upon everything being interconnected. So life couldn't be separate from non-life, from the inorganic. So I suppose you could say that already in Zarathustra you would have that notion, but certainly all that the text says is that life is will to power. But then by 1886, by Beyond Good and Evil, you have this beyond biocentrism, because then it's the world. It's die Welt, the whole world, and nothing is will to power, nothing beside. And that comes out in that aphorism 36 of, the Versuch, the experiment. Let's suppose that it's all just a matter of our drives. That beginning of that aphorism where he said, it's just, let's make this experiment, that it's all a matter of drives. But then he says, suppose we couldn't get up to or down to anything else other than that. And then he says, well, maybe we don't need to. Maybe the way I read it, it's all will to power. And then he says, of course, you wouldn't have will working on something that wasn't will working upon muscle or matter or whatever. It's all going to be will working on will. I think it's Lawrence Lampert that talks about the teaching of will to power as saying, okay, what is going on? This is what there is will to power. And then the eternal return as how this works, how it is, what is now, how do we manage that? How do we live that? Well, we live as if everything is interconnected, which from the teaching of will to power is how it is. It's all interconnected. I wanted to say earlier that to stress the somatic practice aspect, to emphasize the body and so on, and I've spent a lot of my career sort of looking at Nietzsche and Taoism, or Nietzsche and Buddhism, and those comparisons seem to me to be can be very fruitful. That you see things in Nietzsche that, well, let's put it personally, I came to see things in Nietzsche that I hadn't noticed before, and to see connections and so on. And I've argued with people over the years who say, well, but you're reading stuff into the text. I don't think so. But what I am doing is I'm highlighting certain facets, certain aspects. These East Asian philosophies would emphasize perhaps more the way the whole thing works harmoniously. It all works together. Of course, it's got tension in it, but it's not just a matter of conflict and the will to power. The whole world is will to power. I understand as will to power as interpretation. This is one point, and he says, "What if all Dasein is interpretierendes?" It's all interpreting. Yeah, and it's so everything is interpreting everything else. Everything is construing everything else. You can look at power. We just take Macht rather than Wille zur Macht. There is, of course, the brute force kind of power that dictators and so on exercise. They can maim people, kill them, throw them in prison, do all sorts of things to them. But then I think Nietzsche would point out, as soon as they're dead, the power is gone. But you look at the other end of the spectrum, and this is the philosophy as the most spiritual will to power in Beyond Good and Evil, der geistigste Wille zur Macht. That's will to power that's will to power as interpretation. That someone like Socrates gives us an interpretation of the world. He construes the world in a certain way. Along, you need someone like Plato to write it down. Nietzsche, I think, sees himself in that same tradition, that philosophy makes the world in its own image, he says, so that he, like Socrates, like Jesus as well, I mean, if we take him as a philosopher, they lost out in relation to the people who had the brute force power. They both went under as a result of that, but they're still very much with us, and that power is lasting. It has what do they call it? Legs, or I don't know, stamina, or it lasts. This exploitation, life is Ausbeutung, and all the things that life is, the sort of literal exploitation and domination, and so many people complain that my reading gives us too soft a Nietzsche, which I don't think it does, but it's just, I think the point there is that those passages in Beyond Good and Evil that talk about life that way are descriptive. I mean, he's saying this is what life is. But then the question is, how do we live as human beings, and then especially as philosophers?
Right.
Well, it doesn't mean you have to rape and pillage and dominate all the time. In fact, if you're going to live as a philosopher, you think, you hike around, you interpret the world in ways that are powerful. And in what I think Nietzsche thinks is a much more worthwhile form of power, because it's, as I say, it's lasting. It lasts. I think of Nietzsche's stance, I think of National Socialism. And I think of Nietzsche's stance on nationalism, which he found pretty crude and not very interesting, not very helpful. Think of his, as you mentioned earlier, his take on the Germans. It's almost always. I think of, in some of his reaction to his sister and her husband, the terrible.
Forrester.
Yeah, Forrester. I think it was in reaction to her that he talks, I think it's in Beyond Good and Evil, about racial purity. And he says, that's going to get you that's going to be really boring. And he says, crossbreeding among strains can either turn out also boring because it doesn't quite work. I'm sorry, I haven't looked at these passages for a long time, but it's I can find it later. Or it can be really interesting. It can be interesting because the multiplicity that he's always so keen about, the Dionysian multiplicity, can work. Either it can sort of neutralize itself and become bland, or it can give you something really spectacular. And I think of, did you see that film? This English author, Ben McIntyre, wrote about the colony, Nueva Germania, that the first, what's it called? I used to have the book. And then there was a documentary film.
I heard about it.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that. No.
And the film is amazing because those people are still there.
Yeah, I heard about it.
And their German is almost incomprehensible because they were talking to themselves for so long. And they all look pretty disturbingly inbred. And you just think, God, Nietzsche must be grinning in his grave or on that one. A higher version of humanity would certainly never come for Nietzsche through racial purity. In fact, it would be the opposite. You'd want to be, crossbreeding all the time. Oh, sorry, just one other thing. I think if he had seen Hitler, for example, the Nazis in general, that move, or that thing that happens psychologically, where you project the shadow onto the other. And Nietzsche's, his working with that interplay between inner and outer psychologically and so on, when he says, loving oneself is so difficult because knowing oneself is so difficult. And knowing oneself is so difficult because a lot of it is very unpleasant. That whole theme in Nietzsche would militate very much against something like the collective projections. Cultivating oneself or overcoming oneself has to do with facing the oyster, the slipperiness, the pretty disgusting stuff that's there, owning up to it, and not projecting it on the other. And I think what you have in the phenomenon of National Socialism is precisely an encouragement of, yes, it's all their fault, that we are pure, we are virtuous, and so on, because they are the bad ones.
Precisely.
Yeah, and I think that if he'd been around to see the consequences of his writing, and I'm not sure, we'd have to talk more about the responsibility aspect,
Yes.
but certainly if he'd seen what was going on in the 20s and 30s, he would have been shaken. He would have been, it would have been sobering for him, because he did write these things that are, I do think he's a dangerous thinker. The difficulty that Zarathustra has with the rabble, the rabble is within as well. Of course, it's out there, but before one gets too worked up about the rabble out there, you have to realize that's us, that's me, that's you. We are that.
Yeah.
And there's that one aspect of this inner-outer interplay is that the exercise of cruelty, hammering the stone of the human being into shape and so on, has to be done on oneself first. There's that sort of retroflective, that you have to see, no, the rabble is here, the ugliness, the maggots in the bread of life and all the stuff that has to be addressed. I'm sorry, it's me too. And I think that there's a set, the way I read Zarathustra on this issue is that disgust has to be felt, has to be acknowledged before, and Zarathustra has to hammer himself into shape, which is painful business, before he then may have the right to say, okay, now I'm coming after the rest of humanity. Yeah, right. And that's, I think, one way of rejecting the claim that no, this philosophy Nietzsche didn't mean it, but this philosophy leads to fascism and so on and so forth. No, I don't think it does, because fascism is precisely based on not doing any of these difficult things that, I think Nietzsche is an inspiration here. Walter Benjamin is for me too. That you see what Nietzsche does when he brings, let's forget Deleuze for the moment on the concept, but if we just think of what concepts were up until Nietzsche's time, that I think one way of saying why Nietzsche is so interesting and so revolutionary is that he's not really working with concepts. He's working with images more. And certainly Zarathustra that's not a book where, it's all imagery. And I think the imagery, there's a certain logic to the imagery. When you look at it, when you really get into it, the connections are so, there's many of them and they're so amazing. Obviously, he couldn't have thought that through. We're going back to the Dionysian and so on, that if we can believe his story about the three 10-day periods, 10 days for each part, then, and he did talk about sometimes that it was just rushing through him, these images. So I think Nietzsche then prepared the ground in that he loosened up, shook up what our idea of philosophy is. We have language that's going beyond the conceptual or coming in beneath the conceptual, whatever. We've got language that we can either hear spoken or we can see it, we can read it. And then we've got sound and we've got music. And, there Nietzsche, coming after Schopenhauer, I think really sees, yes, and that can open up an image so well, that can provide depth and so on and so forth. So what fascinates me about the medium of film is that one could follow, that I think you got Nietzsche shaking it up and opening it up to poetic imagery. You've got Walter Benjamin doing something similar with an awareness of the technology and of what the technologies can do. That's very interesting. And the media at your disposal are, this may make it more difficult rather than less. There's so much is possible now. When Nietzsche was at Schulpforta and wondering what to do, and he was really having problems with his own multiplicity because he was good at so many things. And then he chose philology rather than philosophy at first. As music, especially Zarathustra, he says explicitly, not only is this text music, it's a symphony.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I think he succeeded in that he did something, there's something about his language, his poetry, that he wrote as a musician. He wrote philosophy as a musician. And so to do philosophy in the medium of film is one hell of a challenge, but it's very much in the spirit of what Nietzsche was doing, I think, that then you bring even more, you have more tools, you have more media, you have more that you can do. And I think it's a very powerful medium. I wish I could get back to it myself.